Bonjour, Kinamagi Nene, Ireland Indigenicas, and welcome to our next episode in Social Studies. Welcome to today's episode for this Friday, September 11th, 2020. Today's topic is from iCivics, voting. Will you do it? As is the case in all social studies lessons, you'll find the topic within our Google Classroom that says social studies. Scroll down to today's date. Click on the link. You're going to see our objective today is I can describe the expansion of suffrage or the right to vote. The definition of suffrage is, in fact, the right to vote. You'll see the directions. You're going to either read this voting fillable reading PDF or listen to this recording. Then you're going to come back and you're going to do the fillable activities, which will also be covered in this recording. This is the assignment for today, so you will click on that and then you will be able to fill it out. You type right in the box once we get to it. I'll show you that in just a few moments. So let us begin with the reading. Voting, will you do it? Everyone has a part. When the founders wrote the Constitution way back in 1787, it was a lot like a group project, one that had a really high stakes grade. They needed everyone to do their part in order for it to be successful. In the end, they came up with a pretty efficient form of government that asked citizens who were eligible to contribute by voting. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But when the Constitution was drafted, more people in the newly formed United States of America were granted suffrage, the right to vote, than in other countries at the time. You might have called it revolutionary, but it would actually take a lot longer before all citizens had this right. Take a step back. Ask a really old person, and they'll tell you that people had to fight for the right to vote. It's true. The question of who would be eligible to legally vote in the United States when the Constitution was written was left to each state to decide. At the time, white men over the age of 21 were thought to be most qualified to run the country. And early on, those men had to own a certain amount of land in order to qualify too. Who did this leave out? Most people of color, most women, and adults under the age of 21 couldn't vote. Now, whose interest do you think the government cared most about advancing? Well, the people who could vote for the leaders were going to make those decisions, of course. Quick civics lesson. Voting is a lot like a microphone. With it, you speak loudly. Without it, it's unlikely that anyone will hear you. Now imagine trying to get the right to vote when you don't already have that right. It was really, really hard. Since voting works like a microphone, when you vote, your legislators and leaders listen. They're accountable to you. And if you don't like how they're representing your interests, then you can choose to vote for someone else in the next election. But women, African Americans, Native Americans, and adults under the age of 21 couldn't do that because they couldn't vote. So legislators weren't necessarily compelled to change the voting laws for those groups. So how did things change? In two ways. Because voting laws are determined by the states, some groups worked to get each state to change its laws. Others worked to get the people in Congress to write amendments or changes to the Constitution. People in each state then voted to ratify or approve those changes. Once the amendments became part of the Constitution, all states had to follow them. But it wasn't that simple. For both methods, groups organized, wrote letters, circulated petitions, lobbied political figures, and staged nonviolent protests. They used civil disobedience, which is when people intentionally refuse to obey the laws as a form of protest, to bring attention to their cause. Over time, each group swayed public opinion, and the national government was pressured to continue to extend voting rights to more and more of its citizens. Before we go to the next page, you can say citizenship doesn't equal voting. You might think that citizenship would automatically entitle a person a say in their government. Wrong. 14th Amendment granted African American citizenship, but the 15th Amendment had to be added to give them the right to vote. But for years, most states just ignored it. The Indian Citizenship Act granted Native American citizenship, but still they couldn't vote. Women in DC residents have always been considered citizens, but they couldn't always vote. When you're a citizen, but if you're not 18 yet, you can't vote either. Let's go on to the next page. Side B here. Voting. Will you do it? When did all adult Americans get the right to vote? Take a look at this timeline to see how voting rights expanded over time. 1788, the U.S. Constitution is ratified. States retain the right to set their own voting laws. In most cases, white men over the age of 21 who own property can vote. So that's a small percentage. Right now in this classroom, it would be, well, now me, but if you'd asked me 2 years ago, not owning property, wouldn't have been me. 1792 to 1856, states amend their constitutions to remove the property requirements associated with voting. All white men over the age of 21 can vote. We get to 1870 and the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified. The amendment prohibits states, including those in the North, from denying the right to vote on account of race, color, or prior enslavement. Black men over the age of 21 can now vote. But from 1877 to 1968, states passed and enforced Jim Crow laws. Despite the adoption of the 15th Amendment, laws that enforce literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause, as well as outright intimidation and violence, disenfranchise or stop African Americans from voting. Government institutions like the Supreme Court upheld many of the laws. So yes, in your grandparents, or in my case, my parents' lifetimes, there were a number of laws that made it very difficult for African Americans to vote within the United States. So while this really kind of starts 100 years before I was born, 9 years before I was born, some people still were not being able to allowed to vote in our country. So it's not something that's in the long distance past. It's in the near past. All right, going to 1890, Wyoming becomes the first state to grant women the right to vote. Women's groups continue to lobby state by state to have voting rights included. So Wyoming, 1890, women get the right to vote in the state. 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified. The amendment grants women the right to vote. Despite their participation in getting their amendment passed, African American women continue to face discrimination and disenfranchisement due to Jim Crow laws. But there are still more people that have no right to vote. 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act is passed. This act grants full citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. However, voting rights are still determined by the states, and Native Americans face discrimination at the polls. This is now within my grandparents' lifetime. 1961, the 23rd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified. Residents of Washington, D.C. can participate in presidential elections. To this day, their license plates reference taxation without representation. 1962, Native Americans earn voting rights state by state. Utah is the last state to guarantee voting rights for this group. 1962. That is my mom was in high school at that point. That's how recent it was before Native Americans were finally given our suffrage. And something we will discuss as we go through the social studies curriculum this year. 1964, the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified. This amendment bans the use of poll taxes in federal elections. 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed. This act finally reinforces the 15th Amendment, outlawing discriminatory voting practices and allowing federal oversight of voter registration in states that had disenfranchised minority voters. And in 1971, 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified. This amendment, passed in the wake of the Vietnam War, lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. It is ratified in just 2 months, the shortest time of any amendment. So there's a lot of things for our discussion in there. During class or during our Zooms, you are welcome to share your feelings on how spread out the granting of suffrage really was. Page 3, is it my turn yet? It won't be your turn until you're at least 18 years of age. But when or if it already is, will you vote? Believe it or not everyone does. Some people don't think that their vote matters, are just plain fed up with politics, or simply aren't involved enough to care. Is this starting to sound more like that group project? Our representative democracy works best when everyone who can does their part. When people don't vote, guess who's calling the shots? Not someone the people wanted. Guess who's fixing the problems you care about? Probably no one, because the officials in office aren't worried about if they'll need your vote to stay. Voting doesn't just give you a voice in our government. It is also a mechanism that we use to point out what we want fixed and changed in the country. It's a right and responsibility that we have as citizens to keep our government functioning at its best. Well, what's the big deal? It's pretty easy for us to get lazy and take things for granted, especially when things seem to be working out fine. You may think that not voting is no big deal, but it is a very big deal. True, if you don't vote, then things will probably continue on as always. But what if everyone in your community starts to feel that the way that you do? And what if those who do show up to vote do things you don't like? Voting is your way to protect your basic freedoms. And if you don't care about them, why should anyone else? Simply showing up to vote is a great start. Voting in the big election for the president is good, but there are other elections for offices and issues in your state and in your localities. Less people show up for these. And when you get right down to it, your voice matters much closer to home. Decisions about the safety of your local drinking water or how to fix large potholes in your street are not something the president will fix. It is up to you to decide who can best do the job. Now to vote. It won't be long before it is your turn. 2 election cycles for most of us. To vote, that is. First, you need to register. And you'll do that once you get about 16, 17 years of age. Then you'll need to find out who is running for office in your local, state, tribal, and federal elections. This text doesn't necessarily cover tribal voting, but we do have a representative democracy here in our community. You want to know who best to vote when it comes to our tribal elections too. Support the candidates, see what they have to say about the issues that matter to you. Support the candidates who you feel will do the most good. This doesn't have to be done with money. Campaigns are always looking for volunteers to spread their message. And of course, what they really want is your vote. But I still have questions. Page 4. How do you register to vote? That's going to vary state by state. You'll want to look that up when you get closer. We're trying to make it easier to vote. A lot of times you can do it at the Secretary of State. What if I can't get to the polls? Well, actually, this has been a big topic. And here in Michigan, we are now a no reason absentee balloting state. So all I have to do is request in writing of our local clerk for them to send me an absentee ballot. I fill it out and I can either drop it off to the clerk, to a drop box, or send it in the United States mail. And you'll notice at the top here, some states have all mail-in elections. It means everyone's voting by mail. You don't know what you don't know. Some states have introduced laws that can make it harder to vote. Strict voter ID laws require citizens to present photo ID when they show up to vote. These laws can make it hard for voters who cannot afford or get the documents needed for the photo ID. Usually this affects those with little income, racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. The laws are intended to reduce voter fraud and have plenty of supporters. After all, you don't want someone pretending to be you or someone else casting a vote. But the laws have also prevented legitimate voters from exercising their right as well. as you get closer to voting, make sure you know what to do if you don't have those documents in order to make sure you still get your suffrage. And that may vary state by state. You should check your state's law to see if you need to provide an ID on election day to vote. If you forget your ID at home or don't have one, some states may still allow you to vote, but may require that you sign an official form confirming your identity or give you the option to cast a provisional ballot, also known as a temporary ballot. Instead, this type of ballot is used when a voter's eligibility to vote can't be proven on election day. Later, if the voter's identity can be verified, the vote is counted. As part of the Voting Rights Act of 1865, the federal government was given the ability to keep an eye on voting procedures in states that had a history of voter discrimination. But a recent Supreme Court decision in the case of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 struck this rule down. It's more important than ever that you know the voting procedures in your state. You can check your state's election website to find out what times the polls will close, the type of ID you need to provide, and how to alert your voter registration officials to a name or address change or a typo in your voter registration information. Knowing the rights you have as a voter when you go to the polls is important to ensure that no one disenfranchises you or stops you from voting. And actively voting in state elections ensures that your representatives know how you feel about laws that may affect how voting works in your state. So there's a lot of reading there. You're going to summarize this by basically saying, know the rules, look them up ahead of time. Don't wait until August, September of the election year. Look ahead of time. Know the rules. All right, so let's go back to our classroom and let's click on the activities page so you can see what you're going to do. You will have a copy of this in your Google Classroom. It won't be just a PDF, but you'll be able to fill it in. So you'll have this copy and not just looking at it as a picture like this. Type your name on it, make sure that's there. Then you're going to type short answers to the questions like, number one, what was the number one reason 18 to 29-year-olds didn't vote in the 2016 election? Well, you can see here that's a pretty tall column, so you're going to look and say, what was the number one reason here? And these are all 18 to 29-year-olds in this section. Question two, now which reason did those with college experience give more than those without? So you're going to look for the darker ones, and you can see that there are a few. Three, which reason did those without college experience give more than those with it? So you look for some where it's a little taller, like this one here. Or why do you think the reasons differ based on college experience? That's going to be kind of your own opinion there. So give me your best guess if you're incorrect. Okay, that's all right. 5, which reason surprises you most and why? Make sure you include the why. 6, which reason does not surprise you and why? So what's kind of obvious to you, like, yeah, I already guessed that. But make sure you tell me why. And it doesn't have to be a long why, no more than a sentence. 7, brainstorm some things you could say to a person who doesn't vote in order to convince them. So pretend I'm not a voter. Could tell me what you would say to me to make me want to vote. 8, choose the best response from 7 and you create a bumper sticker. This one's more for fun. If you don't do that one, my life will go on. But it is kind of cool to say, what if the reason was, if you don't vote, I get your milk, saying you want to keep your milk, vote. Something like that. On the back side, or continuing down, you can see same-day voter registration are the states in the red and the state. So you're going to sort them. Is Alaska, and you look for the shape of Alaska. If you need to use a US map to make this easier, a political map would be a great tool here. And you'll type them in, so you would write Alaska, AK. If you just use the abbreviations, I will be okay with that. 2, what are some benefits of having same-day voter registration? Think to yourself, how does it make it easier if I can register right as I'm about to vote? 3, what are some possible problems that could happen with same-day voter registration? So what could go wrong with that same-day voter registration? And 4, do you think same-day voter registration should be available in every state? And tell me why or why not. If you're stuck, Feel free to Google some information about same-day voter registration. You probably will get a lot of sketchy information, but it might be there. On the back side, you're going to fill in some things here. The federal government has passed laws with accommodations to help people vote when it might otherwise be difficult for them. Read the law summaries and fill in the blank. So you're going to read about the ADA, the VRA, and the MOVE Act, and see if you can fill these in. And then tell us, read the descriptions, write the year each person was allowed to vote and which amendment or law granted it. You can look back here. Um, and after that, you can kind of go with the bonus there. I think by the time you get through 2 pages, I'm probably pretty good with this. I do not expect you to do all 8 pages. I will note that in the Google Classroom because I don't want you to spend all day on social studies, but the first 2 pages at max. Page 1 would be the important page. Page 2 is a good act, and then you could probably stop there. So if you want to do page 3, since I showed it to you, that's cool, but you're not obligated to. So we'll assign pages 1 and 2. Voting is very important. I'm hoping that this series on Fridays will help you understand not only the current election cycle heading into the presidential election this November, but will motivate you to want to know more about voting so that in 2028 you can walk in there and cast your ballots in the state, the federal, and even tribal elections. Hope you all have a Mental Gijagad. Bamapi.